Good afternoon. It's still morning. Good afternoon. And welcome to the Ford Calumet Environmental Center at Big Marsh Park. My name is Stephen Bell. I'm the center director here. I've been here for about 5 years, and it's been an amazing process to see this park change and grow and evolve, and all of the restoration and remediation work that's happened here. Big Marsh Park was envisioned as both a hub for the Chicago Park District's work on the southeast side of the city, and also as a gateway to the Calumet region. So Big Marsh and the work that we do, the women and the men that do the restoration and remediation are housed here, and we work on a suite of 5 parks across the southeast side, and then we have a couple that we just started on. Our parks are Steelworkers Park, which is on Lakeshore and East 87, Marion Burns Park, which is on 103rd, Big Marsh, Indian Ridge Marsh, which is kind of kitty corner to us off of Torrance, and then Hegwish Marsh, which is over the bridge past the Ford plant. And together, that's about, it's right around 1,000 acres. So 1,000 acres of natural sites that are being restored. All of these sites are on what I would consider forgotten, abused, neglected spaces that were negatively impacted environmentally by industry. There's lots of great things that we can say about industry in terms of communities and cultures and families and putting food on people's plates and bringing all of this together and making a strong economy in this region. What the Park District is doing is trying to take these spaces, restore them, and create community assets. So we want to make these spaces where people and flora and fauna coexist, and that they're spaces where people from these, particularly these neighborhoods and Chicago as a whole, visitors to Chicago, can come in and engage with, and enjoy, and benefit from being outside. So that's our primary vision. I should say, like, if I take a step back, I know we're going to talk, there's a lot that we're going to talk about. When I think about this area and I think about the Calumet region, a lot of times I envision what it looked like thousands of years ago. And the stories that have been told to me and the way that people describe it and paint this image of these like vast, huge, interconnected habitats of prairie and savanna and woodland, and perhaps most importantly, wetlands, right? And wetlands, the way we talk about wetlands here is that they act as the kidneys of these habitats, right? Kidneys, just like in our body, they clean and they purify, they act as nurseries for this vast array of animals and plants and amphibians and reptiles and insects, and of course people, and the people that came before us, and the community, the Native Americans, and then switching over to industry and the impact on industry, and then here we are. So I'm thrilled that we're having this conversation. I think that there's all kinds of threads of this conversation that run throughout lots of communities and lots of places in the United States and lots of places across the globe. And I'm envisioning that a lot of you that are here today have pieces of those threads and conversations going through your head. And I hope this collective discussion will lead us to something positive and bigger and better, and something that we can all learn from. So I thank you all for being here. I do want to just 2 more things to add before I introduce our special guest, David McGowan. One is that in the process of restoring these sites, we've discovered some really interesting, unique things. Some plants and some animals and some birds that have persevered and are living here, and hopefully they're going to continue. And that's a really positive, exciting piece of this puzzle that we weren't necessarily anticipating. And then the second thing, I wanted to thank the folks in the back of the room that came here to the table, from the Forest Preserves, Calvin and Sam, from Ford, Jake and Kay, from the Wolf Lake Initiative, of course, Michael Bowes and his lovely wife. And then also IUPUI, the grad student of Broxton Bird Cam, who's in the back there. So I know we have a lot to talk about, but if you have a chance, you can check out what they're displaying. That would be awesome. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce David.
Thank you, Stephen. Hi, I'm Dave McGowan. I'm a filmmaker. Yeah, thanks, man. So we're planning to do an hour-long documentary about the history of the Calumet region through the lens of the Anthropocene Epoch. And you're going to hear about what the Anthropocene is today from our speakers. But I wanted to let you know that through that research of the history of the Calumet, it had such a robust history of industry, of Native American history, of just having an impact on the American cultural scene, that we thought that the history of Calumet has to be told not just for the people of the Calumet, but for the country at large. But as we were looking into the history of the Calumet, it became apparent, at least to me, that the Calumet experienced this thing called the Anthropocene Epoch early into the 19th century, and they went through the arc of it, and how the people of the Calumet have reacted to the Anthropocene has shown us some lessons for the rest of the world. So the film, when it's done, is not just going to be about the Calumet. It's going to be about the lessons of the Calumet that we can share with the rest of the world. And that's what brought us here. And the reason why we wanted to do it here at Big Marsh is because this is a very good example of how humanity is adjusting to the Anthropocene. Because now we've overwhelmed the Earth's natural systems. And it's now on us to reimagine what nature and wilderness are. And so Big Marsh is a really good example of this. This was a coke oven here 60 years ago, 100 years ago. They've completely overwhelmed this entire environment. The city of Chicago said, hey, this is a really great spot for birders. Let's reimagine what it could be after the coke ovens have gone. And I think Stephen in the Chicago Park District has done a great job. The facilitator for today is an environmental historian from IUPUI, Phil Scarpino. And he's going to just get up and talk a little bit about our speakers and about what environmental history is.
Well, welcome. In case you got here, welcome, filmmaker rolling. My name is Phil Scarpino. I'm an environmental historian from Indiana University, Purdue University of Indianapolis, and I'm the introducer today. But as I was driving up yesterday, thinking about maybe two or three things I could say very briefly before I started introducing, two images came to mind that I think all of us have heard of, right? And one is that picture taken in about 1978 from Apollo, right? It shows the Earth hanging out there in the vastness of space, which tells us that's it. That's all we got. That's our one shot. There's no place else to go. And the other is the idea of the Anthropocene, right? Which says that human actions are a primary driver of global environmental change. And I think with that knowledge comes the obligation to understand what we've done and try to do something positive to affect change. And we're going to hear three speakers today that fall into that category. They can tell us where we've been and what we're doing and where we're going. So I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time. And the first one is John R. McNeill. I copied some very interesting stuff off your website. So he says that he was born and raised in Chicago and passionately devoted to Chicago's professional sports teams. There's a PhD from... You can go farther with that if you want. He's a PhD from Duke University. He's presently on the faculty of Georgetown University, where he holds two appointments: Distinguished University Professor, Edmund A. Wall School of Foreign Service, and Distinguished University Professor, Department of History. His areas of expertise include the Anthropocene, environmental history, global cities, global history, and world history. His primary area of research is environmental history, and he has served as president of both the American Society for Environmental History and the American Historical Association. He's author or co-author of 8 books and dozens of scholarly articles. Particularly relevant to this gathering is his volume, Something New Under the Sun, An Environmental History of the 20th Century World, and The Great Acceleration, Environmental History of the Anthropocene since 1945.
Thanks, Phil, for that. As you heard from Dave McGowan, he's working on a project about the Calumet area through the lens of the Anthropocene. So he needed somebody to talk about the Anthropocene. That's me. That's my role today. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit about it. I'm going to try to define it. I'm going to try to explain some of the justifications for the concept, referred to here as scale, scope, and pace of global environmental change. I'll say a little bit about the scientists who are most deeply involved in it and what their agendas are. A little bit about some of the controversies surrounding the concept of the Anthropocene. I'm not going to say anything about the Calumet area, partly because I don't know much about it, but I'm going to learn more about it in the course of the afternoon. So this is sort of big picture framing for what follows. And even though, as a professor, typically when I start talking, it takes me 50 minutes to stop talking, I'm going to try to go through this fast so that we can get to the main act quickly. But I do want to say that I'm not a geologist or the subgroup of geologists that pays attention professionally to things like the Anthropocene. I'm a historian. I'm actually a member of the Anthropocene Working Group. That's a fluke. It's because I wrote this book that Phil mentioned, and a geologist read it and asked me to join the group of scientists that are wrestling with the proposition that a new epoch of geological time should formally be adopted and called the Anthropocene. Now this amusing sign is slightly off target because if it is going to be adopted, which is quite uncertain, it's likely to be an epoch and not an era, and these are different things in geology. So this is, at the moment, a suggestion, a proposition. It's not something that the geologists have necessarily adopted, although they might. It's also a recognition that the Earth system, and I'll explain that very briefly in just a moment, is in a place that is unfamiliar and unlike anything that we know about in the history of the Earth. Earth system science, a fairly new term, intended to recognize the interconnectedness of a whole lot of processes that are, in some cases, atmospheric, oceanic, geological. They involve biogeological cycles of sulfur and nitrogen and carbon, and that's Earth system science. And if you look at the Earth system, well, it's different from what it used to be, and from, insofar as we can tell, what it has been over millions and millions of years. The proposition is also a recognition that human action is responsible for the Earth system being in a different place than ever before. Here's a typo. Markets. Should be markers. Sorry about that. It's also a recognition that suitable markers exist, or probably exist, that will allow geologists to designate a before the Anthropocene and an after the Anthropocene. Geologists have to have this in order to slice up Earth history into intervals of time. I'll say a little bit more about the geological parts of it in a moment. But the term Anthropocene has escaped the control of geologists, and it's used in a lot of different contexts now. Philosophers use it, literary scholars use it, journalists occasionally use it, historians sometimes, not so often, use it. And for those communities, the meaning is a bit looser than it is for geology. And it's something of a synonym for any of these terms, which means, in my view, the term is getting fuzzier because different communities use it for different things. And if the geologists formally adopt it, maybe that will make it less fuzzy and more useful. Okay, back to geology for just a moment. This is the way the geologists divide up Earth history. This is long, long, long ago, and this is more recent. The most recent epoch here, 11,700 years old, the Holocene. Officially, we are in the Holocene right now. The Anthropocene is a proposed revision to this, which would add a teeny little sliver right here of uncertain depth, because there's still arguments that I'll get to in a moment about how old the Anthropocene is as a geological epoch. If it's going to be adopted, part of the justification for it is the tremendous scale, scope, and pace of global environmental change in recent times. And you can see, without being able to focus on any of the small print here, which is not properly in focus, you can see all of these curves, almost all of them, have a sort of hockey stick shape to them. These ones over here represent changes in the Earth system, like carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. You'll see that in detail in just a moment. Or the acidification of the oceans. All of them following this familiar curve. And these ones over here are supposed drivers behind these global environmental changes. So population history, energy use history, I'll touch upon both of those, but there are a whole lot of others too that I won't touch upon. And they all share this trajectory. Okay, what doesn't appear in any of those graphs, but might also be taken as justification for the concept of the Anthropocene in the realm of biology, is the possibility that we are now entering into a mass extinction event, of which there have been 5 in the history of life on Earth. And this is 500 million years ago, and this is today. And the most recent of these, you're probably familiar with. This is the 65 million years ago bolide impact hit the Yucatan Peninsula and is credited with wiping out the dinosaurs and a whole lot of other critters at the same time. But we might be in the early stages, as indicated in this little turn in the graph, of a 6th mass extinction event. Here is a representation of some efforts to chart the rate of extinctions. These kinds of things are pretty spotty because so many species are out there and haven't been properly cataloged. So just how many other kinds of vertebrates there really are, it's approximate. But it's plausible to suppose that after 1800, the rate of species extinction amongst mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles has shot upwards. Now I'm going to get into water, energy, and a couple other things in a little bit more detail. So this is the history from the 20th century through 2014 of freshwater withdrawals, as the hydrologists call it. That is water used for irrigation or for municipal uses, and most of it's irrigation if you add up the global total. And what I want your attention to focus on simply is this mid-20th century change in the shape of the curve, a point of inflection. More and more water being taken out of lakes and rivers and aquifers and used for something or other. And the next slide is about dams and how much of the world's rivers are now dammed up. And just take a quick look at North America. The red are the dammed up ones, the blue are the free-flowing ones. So North America, and we're about here, I guess, all the big rivers are dammed up. And that water is often used for electricity generation or irrigation, etc. A couple slides about the atmosphere. What you're looking at is sometimes called the Keeling curve, after the scientists who first began to collect data about the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. 1960 here, they first started charting it in 1957, and 2020 here. So 310 parts per million up to 420 parts per million in my lifetime. And that is really unprecedented in, as far as we can tell, in the entire history of the atmosphere. This is a slightly longer look back to about 1700, and here, where it's fairly stable, this is from ice cores. The direct measurements began only in 1958, but it's reliable data. So you can see here that over a 300-year time scale, it's pretty stable, upticks around the late 19th century in terms of the slope of this curve, and then right around the mid-20th century again, as with freshwater withdrawals, boom. Again, my lifetime. Maybe I'm the problem. And this is a much longer view, 800,000 years ago, and you can see a lot of ups and downs in that carbon dioxide concentration, but always between about 180 and 280 parts per million, until the last few decades. So this is kind of repetitive. This is the rhythm of glacial and interglacial moments in Earth history. And then, as you get towards the present, boom, almost instantaneous on this longer time scale. And as I write here, the current rate of rise in CO2 concentrations is about 100 times as fast as the typical exit from a glaciation over the last 800,000 years. So something really different is underway. Why is all this happening? Well, a number of things. For my money, the one most important thing is the scale of energy use in modern history and the variety of energy sources. And this graph shows you both from 1850 to the present, and different bands are different energy sources. So the brown one is coal, the gray one is oil, the blue one natural gas, this teeny little sliver nuclear, and it's all additive. The older forms of energy don't go away. New ones just get added on top. And once again, right around the middle of the 20th century, there's a sharp change in the trajectory, as with the carbon dioxide concentrations. That's directly a result of this energy use, and as with the freshwater withdrawals. And according to one scholar, colleague of mine in the Anthropocene Working Group, more energy has been used, global total, since 1950 than in the preceding 11,000 plus years. That makes, the post-1950 era something different. Why is this happening? It's not just energy. Another line of argument that has some merit to it is that just the sheer number of human beings is an important driver of the Earth system changes that justify the concept of the Anthropocene. This again is a 300-year look. This part, the lighter green, this is projection, and nobody knows if that's really going to be correct or not. But this is the observed and reasonably accurately recorded history of population since 1700. Once again, this is 1950, middle of the 20th century, whoosh, it's taking off. This thin line is the rate of population growth, not the population total. And just in case you're interested in demographic history, that peaked in 1968 and has been going down about as fast as it went up in the first half of the 20th century. And it's now less than half what it was at its peak in my childhood. This is a longer view, shows approximately the same thing. Now, shifting gears. There's a group of scientists that's trying to figure out whether there really is something that the geologists should recognize as the Anthropocene. It's called the Anthropocene Working Group. And geologists are really peculiar creatures. I work with them fairly regularly, and I've known at least one of them since I was a little kid. And they, when they divide up history, they have to vote on it and agree on it. So I'm a historian, and we don't do this. Anybody can proclaim a period or an era, and nobody tries to stop them. If I was to say that this is the Dave McGowan era in the history of Chicago, nobody would try to stop me. They might not follow me, but they wouldn't find this objectionable. But geologists are different. They have an elaborate procedure for deciding whether or not there can be a change in the geological timescale, whether or not there can be officially recognized something such as the Anthropocene. And so the Anthropocene Working Group has to make its recommendation, then a subcommission votes on that, and then an international commission votes on that, and if the vote passes, then the International Union of the Geological Sciences ratifies those votes and accepts it. And this kind of stuff doesn't happen fast. It usually takes decades to get a change in the international geochronographic chart. I'm not getting that name exactly right. At any rate, nobody outside of geology cares anything about any of this except for the Anthropocene. And there, some controversies reign. One other thing I should mention here is that if there are going to be changes in the geological timescale, there has to be something observable in the strata of the Earth, or maybe, second best, in the ice that serves as a marker, before and after. And this is formally called a global stratigraphic section and point, or GSSP. I sometimes call it a birth certificate, but colloquially it's often called a golden spike. And that's an example of one in China. Well, this is like a big statue dedicated to this, and these are huge, I don't know what they're made out of, plaster of Paris or something, images of representations of fossils, marine fossils. So this is the boundary between the Permian and the Triassic. It's 252 million years ago. It was a big, big extinction event in the history of life on Earth. So you got to have one of these, a GSSP, if you're going to change the geological timescale. And that's what the Anthropocene Working Group is doing right now. So it started work in 2009, done a lot of research papers, sent a bazillion emails, dominates my inbox, created a nifty logo. And then in 2019, it voted on these two questions. Basically, should there be an Anthropocene? And if so, should it be dated to about the middle of the 20th century? And the vote was, as you can read here, dominantly in favor of both of these propositions. And now, after that was done in 2019, the group is trying to find the best possible golden spikes, GSSPs. And that work is actively ongoing. There were 12 candidates around the world until last week, and now there are 9 survivors. And by December, there's probably going to be only one. And if I had to bet, it's going to be a lake in Ontario. But I'm usually wrong, so it probably won't be. Okay, the last thing I want to get into, I'll try to make this as quick as I can, is some of the debates about this, because not everybody thinks the Anthropocene is a useful concept or term. Yeah, it's about 20 years old. It's been used very widely. This is all the books in Google Books. The term, these are variations just on capitalization. Whoosh. 2010, it just took off in terms of its frequency in the corpus of published books. Let's skip this one. And get into some of the objections. So the first set of objections are to the term rather than the concept, and it's the prefix that bugs people, anthropos, which means either man or humankind in ancient Greek. And among the objections, the main objection is that this assigns responsibility for the tremendous scale, scope, and pace of modern global environmental change to all humankind equally in an undifferentiated way, and that's not accurate. So the anthropo part of it is unfortunate, and some people get really worked up about this, mainly anthropologists. So they have a whole lot of other terms they prefer, none of which has caught on, none of which is going to catch on.
How do you pronounce that last one?
I have never known how to pronounce that last one. But as an anthropologist from California who thinks it's just the thing.
What does it mean?
But I don't even know what it means. There's something about multi-species collaboration producing environmental change. But
Isn't that where the Nobel Prize winning thing was? Like, that's what I thought you said, when you would show the person in that prefix. It was awarded there. Maybe that's
okay, the Nobel Prize winning guy.
where he first coined the term, but that CHU, I thought that's where Southern.
No, that's somebody else who did that.
Cthulhu.
That was Paul Crutzen, the Dutch atmospheric chemist who, he didn't invent the term, but he began its popularization about 20 years ago. He got a Nobel Prize for something else.
But it was in a conference, I think.
Yes.
In that, and I thought that was the prefix.
Cthulhu
No.
is a fictional creature created by H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote horror stories in the 1920s. And these creatures came to Earth ages ago, were hidden, but then they re-emerged to destroy the planet. So it's all
Could you pronounce that again?
Cthulhu.
Right, I still can't pronounce it.
So Lovecraft is the writer, and he writes
Okay.
all kinds of horror.
And Donna Haraway is the anthropologist who's been promoting the use of this term with very little take on it by the rest of
It
humankind.
makes sense to use it though, because the other terms, capitalism, plantation owners, men, they already have so much cultural baggage on them that to use a made-up word that can be used to describe this actually makes sense.
Well, I have some sympathy with that view, although I'd rather have one that can be pronounced and can be understood.
It's like foreign names. If you want to pronounce them, you can.
Yeah, but there is a barrier to entry, particularly, for example, for students. Okay, let me finish this up. Some other objections are that adopting the term and concept Anthropocene might invite unwelcome behavior. So there are people in the conservation biology community who say, okay, yeah, there's been a huge amount of environmental change and a lot of, and there's virtually nothing left that we can call pristine. But let's not say that out loud because it reduces the logic for conservation biology. If people think that there's nothing natural left, they're not going to want to conserve anything. So let's be quiet about it. A majority of a small minority of conservation biologists take this point of view. A second objection, which I think is stronger, is that recognizing the Anthropocene invites geoengineering. Again, if the planet has been put into a new place, so to speak, by human action already, then doesn't it make sense for humans to try to manage the planet and control the climate by, for example, injecting sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere to control the amount of sunshine that reaches the lower atmosphere. And a lot of people, including me, find that moderately terrifying because things can go wrong with gigantic scale interventions in a system as complicated as the climate system. So that's an objection. Okay, there are geologists who don't like the idea. Some of them will say, let's check again in 1,000,000 years. Some say if the Anthropocene is only going to be 70 years or at most 250 years, it's too short for us, not that useful. Some say this isn't science, this is a political intervention. And some say that the idea originated from an atmospheric chemist, not from within geology and stratigraphy, so how can that be legitimate? Let me just address the notion that it's political and therefore not scientific. That makes no sense. There's a lot of stuff in science that is political, and there always has been. The fact that something has political significance, or can have, doesn't mean it's not good science. Just think of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And Darwin had and still has political resonance, but it's good science. Last set of quarrels is about the date. So yeah, even if we do like the idea of the Anthropocene, and we're willing, perhaps grudgingly, to accept the term, well, when did it start? And the Anthropocene Working Group says about 1950. I'm on board with that. I voted for that. But there are a lot of other opinions out there. Some people think that with the early days of agriculture, enough methane was released into the atmosphere to change the climate, and we should say the Anthropocene began about 8,000 years ago. Others have more recent views, around 1492. Paul Crutzen originally said it should be tied to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and he liked the year 1784, when a particular improvement in the steam engine was patented. And a lot of the disagreement comes from what discipline people are trained in and what kind of evidence they like over other kinds of evidence.
Why do you like 1950?
Because of that whole basket of variables that I showed in the second slide, and because there's a lot of good, that's the sort of global environmental change reason. From the stratigraphical point of view, there's a lot of good potential markers in place around 1950, and if I got to choose, which I don't, it would be the layer of radioactivity associated with nuclear testing that can be dated very precisely and is going to last for hundreds of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years is good enough for me. There are some stratigraphers who think that the marker should have a longer preservation potential or durability than that. But there are things that probably will last even longer than that. Yeah.
How would prevent the sixth extinction, disappearance of wildlife, including elephants and stuff?
Yeah. Well, that also is going to produce a signal in the strata that is going to last for millions of years. And there are some members of the Anthropocene Working Group who are arguing for that as the key variable that's going to mark the Anthropocene. And as I say, by December, this is probably going to be sorted out within the Anthropocene Working Group, and then it has to work its way up through the bureaucracy of stratigraphy. And that's it. Thank you for your patience. I guess we have a few questions, and then we get to the Calumet region.
I enjoyed the talk. I like the setup between all the various fields and volunteer being in one of them. I'm one of the peculiar people you mentioned. So I appreciate the front end of stratigraphy battles. Philosophically, though, how would geologists know when it ends? Because if it ends, would there be geologists around? Or any other scientists or any other humans? That's my interesting comment.
This is one of the reasons I say that geologists are peculiar creatures, because in my conversations with the stratigraphers, they sometimes say, that's not a good choice because in a million years, that signal is going to disappear. And I say to them, in a million years, do you think there will be geologists? And are they going to think the same way that you do? And of course, they recognize the answer to those questions is probably no. But it doesn't matter. They still want a signal, a marker, that is going to be detectable by the methods that geologists have now, a million years from now. So, as human beings, we are all a bundle of inconsistencies.
Tautology.
And geologists are
Peculiar.
but just like us, with different peculiarities.
They don't look for the end of an epoch, an era. What they're looking for is a beginning, and it will be for whatever comes next, for them to decide what the beginning of the next era is.
historically, there's always an end to something else because they picked the beginning one. This one is sort of starting now and doesn't have an end. If they're stuck in, we have to have an end. That's what I think.
Right,
So
it's
it's
open-ended.
The beginning of something is the end of something else. They're looking for something that can be seen around the world that's relatively definitive.
But it's already back done because all these have been lined up till now. So they see when there's an end, when it begins by definition.
Hey, John, one of the things that I took away from your book was that, you know, when you read and think about the Anthropocene, it's pretty horrifying, the future. But there's a piece of your book that you said, hey, why don't we consider some of these things? And you had a number of examples of positive change. I think one of them was the population growth. Also, alternative energies and the impact they're having on CO2. I can't remember the examples exactly, but maybe you could leave us with a little bit of
Well, let me say a couple of things about that. One, all environmental change is good for some and bad for others, or almost all. There may be some that's so extreme that it's good for no creatures. But the great majority is good for some, bad for others. I tend to adopt, I hope, a neutral tone and speak about change rather than destruction or degradation. However, I have to admit, a lot of people, when they listen to me or read what I write, don't see it that way and see a message of gloom and doom. But yeah, the whole Earth system is going to be in a radically different place, and we're moving there with remarkable speed. And that's going to be bad for some people and some creatures. It's going to be good for some people and some creatures. Will that balance out? It doesn't look like it to me. It looks like if you took it in net terms, it's going to be bad, more bad than good. But there are nonlinearities, unforeseeable features in complex systems, and that should make us a little bit humble about evaluating what is just in the beginning stages. With respect to population, the graph that I showed, while population continues to grow and rapidly by long-term historical standards, the rate of growth has been falling rapidly since 1968. There's every evidence that it's going to continue to fall in the decades to come. This is one of the more predictable parts of human behavior, because it responds mainly to changes in fertility, and fertility responds powerfully to urbanization and formal education among females. And urbanization is proceeding apace. Formal education among females is expanding, not perhaps as rapidly as it did in previous decades, but it's still expanding. So that trend is set to continue pretty reliably. Population will stabilize and maybe begin to fall within 50 years. Demographic predictions are real good for 10 years. 50 years gets a bit shakier. But I'm personally pretty sure that population will peak well before the end of this century, and after that will likely slowly decline, which will ease some of the pressures that stand behind the trajectory of the curves that I showed you. With respect to energy, which in my view is the single most important variable in global environmental change, I also think that we're in the beginning stages of a big transition. Historically, all the transitions have been transitions that are additive. additional new kinds of energy come on stream, and as I said before, the old ones don't go away. And so, for example, there's more coal burned now than there was 100 years ago, even though there's oil, natural gas, nuclear, etc., which scarcely existed 100 years ago. But I think that the next energy transition is going to be a bit different, and and less additive, and involve more replacement. And it's going to be less carbon intensive, less methane intensive. Methane is another greenhouse gas, and although it's less important in the aggregate because less of it is in play than carbon dioxide, it's much more powerful than carbon dioxide in heating up the lower atmosphere. So I'm placing my hope here in a variety of renewable forms of energy that are either low carbon or zero carbon. And again, I think before the end of this century that that transition is going to be well underway, and that coal, oil, and natural gas are going to be reduced, not just added upon, but reduced significantly, and that changes the prospects for atmospheric chemistry and the climate system in a way that are likely to make it more stable and slower in its change. I think that's likely. But again, I feel we need to be humble in contemplating the future with all the unknowns and potential non-linearities involved.
Thanks so much.
Time for the Calumet.
Okay, because Ted Karamanski and I have known each other for a long time. When we first met, my beard was black and he had hair. So, neither of which are true at the present. So, Theodore Karamanski, PhD in history from Loyola University, Chicago. He's professor of history and director of the public history graduate program at Loyola University. He has research interests in Civil War, Vietnam War, history of the Midwest, Native Americans in the Great Lakes region, and public history. He was the founder of Loyola's public history program in 1981, which was one of the first programs in the United States. He was the founding director of the National Council on Public History, which is a professional organization that represents people like us. He served as president of that organization. He's very active as a practicing public historian, consulting a wide range of projects related to cultural research, and serving as an expert witness in court cases. We were just chatting this morning. He's recently been in Missoula, Montana, serving as an expert witness. At Loyola, he taught classes on U.S. history and Canadian history. He's co-authored 9 books and many articles and book chapters. Relevant to this occasion is his book, City of Public Memory and Public Spaces in Chicago, which is now out, right?
No.
All right. It's in press. Here's Ted.
Okay. So we're going to bring down the scale a little bit. Also, something a little bit less profound, and also a subject that I assume most of us here are Chicago area residents with an understanding somewhat of the history of the metropolitan area. Some of you may be like me, lifetime Southsiders, where we have maybe a more visceral connection to some of the history that we're talking about here. So I'm going to kind of go through, basically chronology of the history of the Cal in a quick way, and we can dig deeper in questions or comments later, okay? So we talked about the Anthropocene. I won't need to go into that any further, just move on from that. Let's talk about the Calumet. Certainly the most outstanding element about understanding the Calumet region is its physical nature. We're talking about a vast area along the Illinois-Indiana border that is by nature largely a wetland. And it's a wetland because of the recession of glacial Lake Chicago and how gradually over the decades and centuries, Lake Chicago retreated to the current shape of Lake Michigan today. And one of the really dynamic features, of course, is that as the lake retreated, gradually it left a series of beach ridges. And so here you have this wetland at the bottom of Lake Michigan. And Lake Michigan itself is a gigantic barrier to east-west transportation. And so when you get to the bottom of Lake Michigan, from a transportation point of view, infrastructure needs to go through that area. And nature, in some ways, provided a means for that through these beach ridges, elevated above the wetland that covered so much of the rest of the topography. From a human point of view, and people can talk, naturalists can talk about the biological aspect, but from a human point of view, an ecotone, an area where diverse ecological zones meet, is a dynamic environment for human populations because it provides a variety of resources in a readily accessible manner. And that gets us to the native people who pioneered this area. Although the Potawatomi weren't the first Native American group to come into Chicago, they were the group that was here when historical events began to be recorded. And the ecotone of the Calumet region was a wonderful environment, ideal for hunting, for fishing, either in the lake or in the inland, the numerous inland lakes, which we'll talk about, as well as the beach ridges, which could be farmed for agricultural purposes, and the Potawatomi were great farmers. So one of the concepts that I want to weave through this is that of environmental vision. When people come upon a landscape, when they come upon an environment, they look upon it and they make a strategic decision about how am I going to use this land? How am I going to exploit this for the benefit of myself, for my family? And from the Potawatomi point of view, it was, let's exploit this ecotone. Both the wetlands, the dry lands, the forest, the dunes, and the big lakes. Is let's integrate the diversity of these resources into our survival strategy. And that was very unique, because as we'll see, what comes after that is a much more selective and intensive vision instead of a more broad use of a region's resources. Wetland is prominent in the name Calumet. If you take the Potawatomi word for the region, refers to a low body of still water. And that certainly is Wolf Lake and George Lake and so many of the others. Now, all people, all creatures, whether it's the grass on your lawn or it's the actions of individuals, all creatures in the world exploit the environment. And by their exploitation of the environment, they change the environment. And the Potawatomi were no different. By making choices about what resources to utilize, they affected those populations. This is particularly true, however, once the capitalist system is introduced to the region by initially French fur traders and then later Scots and English and even American traders come in. And they are of particular value for the aquatic mammals in the region, beavers and muskrats in particular. And so once native people are integrated into a worldwide economic system, this very diverse exploitation of the environment becomes just a little bit more focused, and that affects these populations. It doesn't have a big impact on the topography or the land in the Calumet region. That's not the case, for example, if you go up to, say, northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin. When you wipe out the beaver populations there, it's going to greatly affect the rivers, and the rivers are going to affect Lake Michigan. But it's a relatively minor impact we're talking about in the Calumet region, unless you're a beaver or a muskrat. One of the dominant themes that comes in the wake of Native American use of the region is Chicago. Chicago is the 800-pound gorilla that tromps all over the history of the Calumet region. And so everything we're going to talk about, for good or for ill, that follows, flows out of this relationship that the Calumet region has with Chicago. And I want to put particular emphasis on the impact of human actions on the wetlands themselves. And the first real effect that I want to touch on is agricultural use of the wetland environment. In the 19th century, beginning in the 1830s really, we go ahead and see moving into the region various Euro-American groups. But an important one were immigrants from Holland. They had experienced farming lands reclaimed from the water, from the ocean. This was, anybody who's ever been to Holland, you know this. And so it's a part of their tradition. And so when they come to the marshlands of the Calumet, their environmental vision is very different than the Potawatomi. And so they look at it from a much more focused point of view about how can we make this an agricultural place. And of course, the way they're going to do that is by draining some of the wetlands. And the product that's going to be produced from that then are going to be truck garden agriculture. Vegetables, fruits, and then in some cases flowers. And there's a market for that. As Chicago becomes incorporated in 1837, you're beginning to have a burgeoning metropolis. And so there is a market for, we need a place close by to grow these things that the population of this growing place is demanding. And so, inspired by this agricultural vision, Dutch, and then German and Irish and others, but the Dutch are a real key group here, come in and they bring their culture with them. But this is hard work. Going ahead and digging the ditches to clear wet. This is hard, muddy, mucky work. And then planting your crops and harvesting them. This is literally stoop labor. So these farmers loved to have big families because that provided you with a useful labor source. And this type of agriculture is often called muck farming because of the sticky, black, rich, heavily organic soil that's left when you've drained a place that's been a wetland for centuries. And really dynamic place to grow things like celery, asparagus, onions. Here we see another of the. This was South Holland, Illinois. Here's an onion farm, just a little bit further south in the Calumet region. And key to these communities working was that so many of them were members of the Dutch Reformed Church. which worked. They were all doing a lot of the same work with this truck garden farming, and then they have common religion to share, and so they create networks of trust that is really important in the way the farms worked, so they could work cooperatively in the peddling and selling of their produce. And that was to the Chicago market. And this is the old South Water Street market. And they would be taking in harvest time, they'd be taking their wagons from South Holland or Roseland or across the Indiana border to Chicago in horse-drawn wagons, where they would set up and dicker with the restaurant owners for the sale of their product. And you can still see some remnants of this if you go to that area of the city. The city of Chicago tried to create a historic district here recently. Another important connection is that, okay, you can farm this mucky land for 6, 7, 8 years, but you're constantly drawing out of there the organic wealth, and so you need to replace that. And the Chicago stockyards were like the perfect source for this, and so gondola cars of manure would be exported from the stockyards to the Calumet region, where they could then, and this is hard, smelly work, spreading this out over your fields. Now eventually, and this lingers on well into the 20th century. My father used to come out to the south, the Calumet region, and he would pick onions and pickles. They would pick pickles too, for Vlasic pickles, he always told me, so that's always what we bought at home. But by the time we get into the late 20s, 1930s, they're getting more and more competition with more year-round growing that's taking place in Southern California. And suburbanization is happening in Chicago. And so the agricultural focus of the region, which still exists, becomes lessened over time. But there's an ecological cost to this whole lifestyle that existed. It's a wonderful book by the novelist Edna Ferber, who's famous for Showboat. She wrote this book called So Big, and it's a story of one of these Dutch farming families, and it goes through the generations. It's a wonderful, wonderful novel to read that kind of just captures this whole moment in time. But because of that moment in time, whole populations of birds are diminished, insects, plants, animals, and part, not all, but part of the wetland has been obliterated by this process. Second big attack on the wetland, of course, is industry. And this, again, is a matter of environmental vision. The farmers who came here, like the Potawatomi before them, they defined the land in one way. And James and Arthur Vissingen, Dutch immigrants, came initially with that same Dutch vision. We're going to have farms here and that. And they begin to go ahead and initially they bought land in the south side Chicago neighborhood of Roseland to sell for farms. But they begin to see another opportunity, and they transition into the marketing of land that they've purchased from farming to marketing this to industrialists. They see a different advantage to the way where this place is and what the topography is. And in particular, you've got these industries like, say, the North Chicago Rolling Mill, which built the first steel rails ever made in the United States. They're running out of space on the North Branch of the Chicago River. And so there's an opportunity, where are you going to migrate to that you can still get big ships coming in with your iron ore, where you got railroad connections for your coal, and still a ready supply of workers. And of course, that becomes the Southworks of the United States Steel Corporation. And again, now we see the wetlands taking the hit for this new environmental vision, for this new way to think of the Calumet region over time. A tremendous amount of slag generated by this plant, changing the landscape. And then they get even bigger, moving over to the Gary Works, beginning in 1906. And here building the harbor, impacting now Lake Michigan in a dramatic way. And here's the Calumet River. I believe that's the Acme coke plant and steel plant on the Calumet River there, with residential communities abutting the site. And I think one of the most interesting things about the Calumet region, and maybe not entirely unique, but fairly unique, is that here in this region we see the three great elements that transform America in the 20th century coming together with steel, oil, and auto production. And I think it's fair to say that if nobody had a bigger impact on the way America looks today than probably Henry Ford. And so, and the Calumet region is like the perfect place where everything comes together for the production of those products. And so we have the oldest Ford Motor Company manufacturing facility in the United States here, still producing, going from the Model A to today's Ford Explorers. And so this is just an overview map of all the different types of production. And again, this is tied to Chicago, so that the Calumet region provides 95% of Chicago's jobs in the metal making industry. This is 1957, I should point out. 72% of the petroleum and coal products are coming out of the Calumet region. 30% of chemicals, stone, clay, and glass production, tearing down the dunes for glass. And 21% of the transportation equipment. So it's really the workshop of Chicago that has blossomed from the vision of those first Dutch realtors way back in the end of the 19th century. And I want to kind of conclude by talking about the fate, we're talking about the wetlands again, the fate of 4 of the large lakes of the Calumet region. Lake Calumet, Hyde Lake, Wolf Lake, George Lake, and Berry Lake, as you can see all 3 right there in this image. And that was another sort of industry, another way of looking at the lake, at the Calumet region, was that these lakes were a marvelous place for recreation. And you had sports clubs here, you had individuals who made their living as pot hunters, going ahead and killing large amounts of waterfowl, of which there were plenty, and then selling them to area restaurants. Here's pictures of the Calumet Gun Club, which was eventually obliterated by the Standard Oil refinery in Whiting. And the lakes were another resource. Before there was widespread electrification, the only way to keep things cool was with ice. And you needed to have sources of ice near the metropolis once more. And Lake Calumet, Wolf Lake, Berry Lake, all were sources for the ice that is then exported to Chicago. Well, that's just, never mind. So here we go ahead, and many of you have been to Egger's Woods, and Heinrich Egger owned that land. He lived on that land for a time before it became forest preserve. But he and his brother were very much involved in a number of industries, in the Hammond, Indiana area, and in particular in harvesting ice from Berry Lake. And these are the structures that he built for his ice workers, so that they could live near where they were getting the ice from. And it's right on the shore of Berry Lake. But he sold out when he heard that John D. Rockefeller's operation was shopping for land in the Calumet region. And so he quickly got out at the right time, as it were. And Berry Lake becomes pretty much obliterated, not entirely, but mostly by the building of the Standard Oil and now the BP refinery complex. And again, this was a huge part of the wetland and sacrificed in order to go ahead and get the petrochemical industry into the region. Wolf's another one of the lakes, of course, and it undergoes dramatic changes, as most of you know. So here's sort of a natural picture of Wolf Lake. But then over time, with all of the steel industries around it, you have these slag depositions that go ahead and shrink the size of Wolf Lake. And then finally in the 1950s, they built a goddamn interstate expressway through this lake. I mean, this is not, when you think of environmental vision, this is not thinking of Wolf Lake as a recreational asset. This is like, it's here, it's in the way, and we're going to go forward to create that transportation network. And anybody who drives through the south side of Chicago knows that you've got 3 interstate expressways all narrowed down into one corridor to get around the bottom of the lake through Calumet. And so they were willing to do anything to make that happen. But people always did think there were always others. You have a counter vision saying, hey, okay, well, you're building the expressway, but we're still going to use this area. We still value it as a place for some serenity and access to the outdoors. And so here we see the state of Illinois dedicating a state park at Wolf Lake.
What date is that Hammond newspaper?
I think this is the 1940s. I think it's the 46 when they dedicate them the monument. I was looking at the top, I couldn't see a date on it. Okay, another one of the lakes is Hyde Lake, which stood between Lake Calumet and Wolf Lake. But again, the slag, the steel mills, just obliterate it. And they would build tracks and bring railroad cars day after day dumping slag and filling in wetlands, as well as some of these very large, not very deep, but very large lakes in the region. And finally, Lake Calumet, which was a much larger, we're sitting here on the shores of it right now, but a much larger, cleaner body of water than we have today. But even by 1882, more than 30 acres of the lake had been consumed by industrial waste, largely slag. And so just in the 20th century, what we've kind of just rapidly gone through, 40% of the wetlands in the Chicago area, which is mostly down here in Calumet, have been filled in. And so we have these communities emerge that are so important, but we don't think of them as having been transformative of our natural wetland area here in Calumet. And so huge amounts, 1 square mile of marshland filled in to go ahead and build the industrial and residential areas of Pullman. But the big transformation for Lake Calumet is not just Pullman showing up on its western shore, but is when the decisions are made to make it part of a navigational improvement. And again, it's that family. Now it's the son of the entrepreneurs who first said, let's go ahead and have industry here. Van Vizingen comes up with this plan to transform Lake Calumet into Chicago's industrial harbor. Now, there was a lot of maritime activity on the Calumet River, Calumet Harbor earlier, but now they want to go ahead and have a place to bring the ore ships and the coal barges into Calumet. They want to have it where you can build industry all around it, where there's plenty of space to do that. In some ways, I think it was like a really bad idea. Because from a maritime point of view, and this is one of the problems that the Port of Chicago has today, is that when you decide you're going to use Lake Calumet as your harbor, you're requiring gigantic, and every year the ships get bigger, till now some of them are 1,000 feet long. You're requiring them to take this long journey up the Calumet River, where there are numerous bridge crossings. And that costs time and money. The lakes are only open for navigation for part of the year, and the steel companies need to get their supplies delivered to them in a guaranteed way. And so what Daniel Burnham called for was building an outer harbor, protected by breakwaters, but building an outer harbor at the mouth of the Calumet River, which would have saved a lot of navigation time. And it's one of the problems that the Port of Chicago has, is that ships don't want to go up the Calumet River. But so much, Chicago kept building along and transforming Lake Calumet. And they really did a tremendous amount of war work in the late 1950s, preparing for the St. Lawrence Seaway, which in 1959 was allegedly going to connect the oceans of the world with the city of Chicago. But the St. Lawrence Seaway was one of the worst things we ever did to the Great Lakes, because of all the invasive species that came in its way. But nobody anticipated that, except there was an 8-year-old boy who wrote to Dwight D. Eisenhower and said this would happen. But I didn't listen. But more importantly, the whole project was underbuilt. And so a large amount of ocean-building vessels never really showed up. Yet we transformed Lake Calumet anyway. And then the worst thing is, what a lot of those ships brought? They brought automobiles and steel. Wasn't that what we were making here? They brought in the foreign competition that ended up taking some of the jobs. So deindustrialization follows, of course. And I always remember the tragic closing of Wisconsin Steel and the sleazy execution of that by the International Harvester Corporation. Southworks closing much later, 1992. But what does this do? We're having these changes. And the steel industry is still huge in the region. And it's still very important to the fate of American manufacturing, what we do here in the Calumet region. But it opens up an opportunity. And this was sort of the challenge for our generation, is how do we respond to this? What environmental vision do we have? And I think that's the kind of interesting thing that happens, is then a rediscovery of the wetlands as a good thing, and a desire to reconnect with that which had been here from the very beginning. And so here we are at Big Marsh, which you could use as a poster child for all the ill that's been done to the Calumet region through these alternate visions of the environment. But also, it's a place now where we can move from brownfields to parks. And with the creation of these facilities, providing niches for the biodiversity of the Calumet region to rebound. And that's what I got for you today.
It's really my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's final speaker, Phil Willink. I saw a picture of it before I met him. I was doing some research on the Calumet, and I ran across a picture of this man up with his chest.
Oh, okay, you can do it, right? You go right here.
And I thought, this looks like a really interesting guy. And I met him, and it turned out that was the case. He's a fascinating scientist, academic researcher, Illinois Natural History Survey, Prairie Research Institute, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Before that, he was a senior research biologist at the John G. Shedd Aquarium, Daniel P. Heather Center for Conservation in Chicago, and before that, he spent years at the Field Museum. There's an extremely long record of professional service. And I'm going to mention a few examples that are apropos of what we're doing here today. Endangered Species Protection Board for the state of Illinois, he's a board member. Association for Wolf Lake Initiative, a member of the board of directors, and he was elected president in 2021. He worked with the Great Lakes Bottom Mapping Data Needs Assessment organized by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in 2020. There's dozens of professional publications. I'll just mention two recent ones: Conservation Guidance for the Least Brook Lamprey and Conservation Guidance for the North Brook Lamprey. Bill Willink.
All right, so today, this presentation sort of focuses on Wolf Lake, but you can basically interchange this with Big Marsh, Lake Calumet, Calumet region. The general story is kind of the same. You sort of heard a lot of this in Ted's particular talk right there. There's going to be a little bit of overlap with Ted's talk, but I'm going to be a bit more aquatic focused and focused in on particular aspects of that. And one of the reasons I kind of left Wolf Lake up here is because I happen to have a lot more fish data focusing on Wolf Lake as opposed to other parts of the region. Now, to understand what's happening with the aquatic systems down here, you first have to understand what's going on with Lake Michigan and some of the processes up there. So here we are, here's downtown Chicago, Lake Michigan. We are right here. And so we have state of Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin up there. And one thing that you need to know about is that the prevailing currents along Lake Michigan near the shore start in the north, run down to the south and over here. And so what this has set up over the past hundreds to thousands of years is that these currents are eroding away the shoreline in Wisconsin and Illinois, picking up that sand and silt, carries it along the shoreline, and has been dumping it into the bottom of the southern end of Lake Michigan. This impact basically has been filling in the lake in this direction. And you may remember some of the pictures that Ted had of the dune and swale and all the ridge lines. That's one of the artifacts of this filling in over there. Indiana dunes, also once again created by sediment from this area, carried down into here. Now, here's a series of maps showing this over time. The top one, this might be a little small, but this is around 4,000 years ago. And it is showing that Lake Michigan extends down to this point. And then what happens is every once in a while a little embayment sort of forms. You get these bays. As the sediment comes down, it forms spits. These spits kind of close this off, and over time you have what is called the early Lake Calumet right here. More sediment fills in, creates an early Wolf Lake. So to go back around 4,000 years, if we were to hold this talk at this site 4,000 years ago, we would be on the bottom of Lake Michigan. All right, we'd be underwater here. This was all lake right here. And it's only slowly filled in over time, creating Lake Calumet, Wolf Lake, and all the other lakes and the wetlands that you were talking about. And also to drive that home, here's sort of a current map of this, and what these lines are. This is peat that has been carbon dated to give you an idea of how old these particular lines are. And you can see from this that Big Marsh Lake Calumet is only around 2,000 years old. All right, so that's relatively young. It's about 2,000 years old. Wolf Lake over here is roughly about 1,000 years old. Once again, relatively young ecosystems. These have not been here that long. And we can go back to some more recent data right here. Here's a map of Wolf Lake from 1896. On this map, I know you can't read this, but each one of these is a number indicating depth throughout the whole lake. And the main point right here is that Wolf Lake at this time, its maximum depth was 4 feet. All right? Generally it was only around 2 to 3 feet, but its maximum depth was only around 4 feet. Here's some pictures from a book by Shelford in 1913 of Wolf Lake. And this is what Wolf Lake looked like in 1913. It was basically a little bit of open water, mostly wetland or emergent vegetation, that is shrubs, grasses, that sort of thing. Get close to the shore, you get the shrubs, go a little bit farther from shore, you'll start to get the trees and things on some of the higher ground. All right? So this is what it looked like only about 100 years ago, like that. It was more wetland than lake, although we'll still call it a lake. So to diagram some of this, we have time down here, and we kind of look at the ecological succession of what's happened at Wolf Lake over the past 1,000 years. Started off basically as Lake Michigan, became a bay, then it was an inland lake once it was cut off, but fairly open inland lake, and then it was transitioning to a wetland. And this was kind of where we are at the beginning of the 20th century. If this process were to continue, that wetland would eventually fill in, it would become prairie, that prairie would have a few trees, would be savanna, and eventually it would become forest. And this particular, what I'm calling an environmental trajectory, is based on what we know has happened there, as well as a lot of the work out of the Indiana Dunes by Cowles, who did a lot of the work on ecological succession. So there's a lot of research detailing a lot of this stuff right here. Furthermore, Cowles, who did the terrestrial work at the Indiana Dunes and elsewhere around here on ecological succession, had a colleague named Shelford. I showed a couple of his pictures. He did similar projects on the aquatic communities in this region and found, kind of the similar thing right here. Furthermore, Shelford saw that there was also changes in the fish communities associated with these changes. And it just so turns out that at Wolf Lake, we have quite a bit of data on fish. Starting with this guy named Seth Meek. He worked at the Field Museum in 1898. He picked up a seine, or a net, hopped on the train in Chicago, got off here in Indiana, took a fish survey, preserved those fish. These fish are still in the Field Museum, all right, from 1898. Somebody else went there 10 years later or so, got some more fish. Another 10 years, picked up some more fish, all the way up basically until the present day. And so I went through the collection, found all these jars, recorded all of this sort of stuff, went through all the reports, and using all of this information, created a list of all the fish that have been known from Wolf Lake from 1898 to present. And I know you can't really read this, but each one of these is a species name right here. And I'm going to show when they appeared. If you're a real diehard and want to know what they are, let me know. I'll send you a paper. All right? It's been published, or you can just Google it. It's out there. So, from 1898 to 1937, these are the fish species that were found in Wolf Lake. And in that time, if you remember, 1898, it was basically this shallow wetland. All right? A lot of grasses and sedges and that sort of thing out there, only about 4 feet deep. And those are the species. And I'll talk more about what those particular species tell us in a little bit. Later in the 1920s, 1930s, actually a railroad was built through the middle of Wolf Lake. You see that homes are being built along the side, so a little bit of industry is moving in. We don't have a lot of resolution of the fish data, so I kind of clumped it all together for this particular period. But those are the fishes we have there. But environmental change is happening. Big change, as Ted mentioned, this is actually in the 1950s, and that was with the construction of the interstate through the middle of Wolf Lake. To construct this, what they needed was fill, sand, to form the basement of the highways. And to get that, they dredged out Wolf Lake, and in order to get the dredging equipment in, they created all these levees all over the place. So Wolf Lake went from 4 feet deep to about 17 feet deep in different parts. It was basically gouged out and was used to construct the highway right through the middle of it, as well as more homes and industry. Lake Calumet, very similar. We have Interstate 94 on the west shore of Lake Calumet. And it was around that same time that Lake Calumet was dredged for the Port of Chicago and all that other stuff. So it was similarly very shallow, dredged, very similar in history as to what we see here. And what we see is certain species have dropped off, we picked up some, and then some kind of blink in and out. Starting in the 70s and 80s, we see a really big uptick in sport fishery. Now, people were always catching fish. They've been doing this for ever and ever and ever and ever. But it became much more managed in the 70s, 60s, but 60s into the 70s. So now we see a large influx of popular sport fish like bass, walleye, muskie, pike, supplemental perch, all of these types of things. These are all top-level predators, and they all eat all the smaller fish, and they can have a significant impact on the fish community. And we see that here. Some more dropping off, we see some additions of some species. And then from around 1980 to 2008, we see a large influx of invasive species. They're not just, these are just fish ones, there's others like zebra mussels that a lot of people have certainly heard about. Invasive species have been in the region since the 1800s, late 1800s. So they're not new with that respect. But we did see a lot more of them starting around the 1980s up into the 1990s in the Great Lakes and elsewhere. So we see that particular change. And so there's a couple of things that I want to talk about based on this particular pattern right here. First of all, the number of species has not really changed much over time. All right. You may see, yeah, it looks like there's fewer here. That actually has more to do with sampling effort and how these species were sampled over time. Our sampling methods for fishes have changed a lot over the past 100, 150 years. And effort kind of goes up and down. As you can imagine, there were almost no fish surveys during World War II. Go around 10 years, starting in the 50s and 60s, then we start to see them. And there's also been a lot more fish surveys recently because of the Clean Water Act and stuff like that. So the number of species hasn't really changed very much. But we do see that I'll go to the next slide here. And we do see something about the ecology associated with these different species, and that has changed. So up here we see that these species were here originally and they disappeared. These species are all typically sensitive to environmental degradation. So once the habitat starts to deteriorate, these are typically species like black-chinned shiner, black-nosed shiner, and some others like that. They're typically the first ones to disappear. And these also tend to be more wetland species. So basically what this is telling us is the fringing wetlands around Wolf Lake are disappearing and the water quality is starting to deteriorate in various aspects like that, and then these sensitive species, they disappear. Then we have some other species that were here the whole time. Bluegill's a good representative of that. This is a species that is very hardy, very durable. We find it in pristine environments, we find it in degraded environments, okay? They can live pretty much anywhere. And so we have a suite of these species that have sort of survived the entire time like that. I didn't really indicate it right here, but then we see some of these species coming in, and these are some of the game fish coming in. And that's, so we see a drop off of some of those here, uptick of some of those here, and then we get things like the round goby. This is an invasive species that enter the Great Lakes and the ballast tanks of freighters from the Black Sea. Same similar story that you probably heard with zebra mussels, quagga mussels, all kinds of other things like that have caused a lot of problems. But then there's a bunch of other things that sort of moved in as well. And so this kind of demonstrates that the human actions on Wolf Lake and the Calumet region in general have had a significant impact on the fish community over time. But what's more important is that our activities have actually changed over time, over the past 100 years. And that is the intensity of whatever pressures we're exerting on the system have changed. Initially, there was a lot of habitat loss. That sort of stabilized, all right? The shoreline sort of stabilized. But the intensity of the human impact changed more to the sport fishery and then from invasive species. Whereas invasive species did not have a big impact up here, they do down here. Yes?
I'm sorry, did this, the introduction, the sport fishery, did they introduce those species or did they naturally?
It's a mixture of both, but what's probably more to the point is that when they manage a fishery, they start putting in a lot of them. So whereas initially, so for example, like in Wolf Lake, always had bass. All right, bass were certainly always there. But there's always a limited number of top-level predators. but people want to catch bass and all these other things, so you start putting more and more of them in there. And that has kind of a cascading effect down the food web, where they're starting to eat some of the smaller fish, some of the minnows like that. So they start to drop off, and then you start to see more of these things. So it's more the supplemental stocking of some of them. Some of them are more new. For instance, tiger muskie is actually a hybrid between a couple of different species, and so some of those things are starting to be introduced. So some of these are certainly novel. Chinook salmon is one that has entered the lake from time to time. They're not native to the Great Lakes. Technically invasive, but very popular. I have a whole hour-long invasive species Great Lakes talk. Salmon are a popular invasive species because we still put them in there. But we also changed the management style, and that if we have a lot of these top-level predators, we are worried about the food base that's out there. So then, if there's not enough for these predators to eat, we start putting in food for them to eat. So we're actually manipulating the top of the food web and the bottom of the food web. And so, once again, we were doing that in a subtle way in Wolf Lake and a lot of our inland lakes. Lake Michigan is like to the extreme where it's crazy, where we're actually managing invasive species as a food base for other invasive species that people like to catch, the salmon and everything else.
I want to find out if there's more sensitive fish species other than the three that we've seen before, including lake sturgeon, Iowa darter, and banded killifish.
Are there more out there? There are. I would say that there are some more out there. Ask me the question again in 5 minutes if I don't answer it for you. I have some slides coming up about that topic. All right. So we see a switch in the fish community that is fitting with the sort of the Anthropocentric impacts on the lake. So going back to this diagram, initially we were on this particular trajectory, and based on how you define Anthropocene, feel free to wiggle this line backwards or forwards. But the idea is that the human impact is basically reset from what was along this trajectory back down to here. We've gone from what is going to be a wetland transitioning to prairie back down to inland lake, like that, both physically and in terms of the fish community and the ecology associated with these species. So, of course, the next question is, where do we go from here? And as you can imagine, there's all kinds of different stakeholders that have all kinds of different opinions about where they would like to go forwards in the future. If you're interested in sport fishing, you will have one opinion. If you're interested in birding, you will actually have a slightly different opinion as to what you would like to see the future of the lake to look like. If you're building a home or housing development along the lake, you're going to have a slightly different opinion. If you're running a business or involved with some of the local industry, you're going to have a slightly different opinion. If you're maintaining the tollway or local roads, you're also going to have a slightly different opinion. So we have, and there's probably more and more opinions. And so, as you can imagine, the future of the lake and the region is still very uncertain as to which direction we're actually going to go from this particular point. But we have had a huge impact to date. Now, given that, fortunately, and this is somewhat accidental, we still have all of these options available to us. Because as you mentioned, there are still some sensitive species in the area. For example, you mentioned the banded killifish, Iowa darter. These both like clean water. They're sensitive to environmental degradation, and they're both in Wolf Lake and the Calumet region in general. There's some other ones. Lake chubsuckers here, if you want a slightly different one. Lake sturgeon is a different story, as I would say. A lot of people like to talk about lake sturgeon. Lake sturgeon, if you don't know, that's the largest fish in the Great Lakes. They get as big as myself or bigger. There's been talk about them being in Wolf Lake and Lake Calumet, Calumet River. Yeah, sort of. I don't want to go on too big of a tangent. It was more of a Lake Michigan population that then 100 years ago, individuals would go into the Calumet River and the Calumet wetlands to feed. Probably didn't live there the whole lives, but probably did spawn on Indiana shoals and other places like that. Largely disappeared because of overfishing, slowly making a comeback. Problem is, for lake sturgeon, their generation time is around 20 to 30 years, or at least 15 to 25 years. So you can imagine this comeback is going to take a very, very long time. But anyways, we still have some sensitive species in Wolf Lake. In other words, you saw this in the film, the mud puppy. This is a fully aquatic salamander. When people think about salamanders, you roll over logs, you find them living underneath logs and stuff. These actually live completely underwater their entire lives, breathing through these gills. Very sensitive to pollution, very sensitive to habitat degradation. We've had a research project ongoing at Wolf Lake on these for several years now, and we have caught several hundred of these and marked them out in the lake. And that's just a tiny part of the lake. And as I think we said in that film earlier, this is one of the largest populations of mud puppies in the state. For some reasons in Wolf Lake. I don't know, complete accident. Not by intention, but they're there. So we have a lot of these sensitive species living here in Wolf Lake, literally right next to the interstate, which is right here, with all this industry. All right. And that's one of the things that is most perplexing about the Calumet region and Wolf Lake and places like this, but also makes it super intriguing and has also made it one of these has really drawn our attention about asking and answering these questions about the Anthropocene. Now, going back to this diagram, there's a few things I'd like to mention right here. First of all, depending upon which direction you want to go, or actually I should step back and say, given the particular geomorphology, topography, geology, soils, hydrology, climate, all of that sort of stuff, if nature was left to its own devices, it would tend to follow this path. All right, this is sort of the direction this region sort of goes on, this lake plain right here. We, of course, have the resources, if we wanted to move it in whatever direction we would wish to do. But the further you get away from this particular trajectory, the more resources would be required to achieve that point and maintain it. And by resources, I mean funding, money, effort in terms of work hours or what have you. I mean, so we could turn the Calumet into a giant bay by dredging it out, but that would cost trillions of dollars. Nobody's saying they're going to do that. But I'm just saying, if you wanted to go that route, yes, that is a possibility. It would be super, super expensive, but the easiest, the most cost-effective and easiest to maintain is something closer to that particular trajectory because of the conditions here. And then a couple other aspects I want to say about this is that traditional views of restoration are not valid in urban settings. And what I mean by this, and there's a couple things. One, there's a practical point of view. And I think a lot of people sort of know this and sense this, in that we have around 10 to 12 million people living in the Chicago region. All right, we are not going to restore anything in the Chicago region to pristine state. Okay, not going to happen. Okay, and I'm going to assume no one's going to argue that particular point. So when you see a lot of restoration projects here, like at Big Marsh, it's largely the best we can do within these particular types of circumstances or something like that. And this is sort of, so whenever we say restoration projects, it's sort of pseudo-restoration projects, all right? Because we're not truly restoring these things to what the conditions were like 200 to 500 years ago within this particular region or whatever. Now, another aspect that I want us to point out here is that perhaps we don't really want to restore to those historical conditions. Earlier, I kept talking about these trajectories, about how all of these ecosystems are changing all the time from one thing to another to another. And that instead of, and a lot of people that when they do restoration projects tend to have a very static view of nature, thinking nature is a particular thing and it tends to stay in that condition for the long term. We know that's not the case. We know that nature's always changing. So perhaps when we talk about restoration, we should focus more upon what a particular area or ecosystem could become with an eye towards the future. And that really should be our aim. Not restoring it to what it was like a couple hundred to several hundred years ago, but restoring it to a condition that it can move along whatever path we so choose for it. And so another aspect of that is that when a lot of people are doing restoration projects, particularly in urban settings, we often talk about this balance between people and nature. All right, and this is where people start to think about sustainability, recycling, green architecture, green landscaping, what have, all of these types of things. They can go on and on and on. But I think that there is actually, we're subtly missing the point here. And that some people sort of pick up on this, but we rarely truly, I think, understand or act on that. Because whenever we talk about human society and nature, you're subconsciously setting up an us versus them situation. All right? Where we have like people on one hand, nature on the other hand, and this sort of creates a conflict, or that we need to find this balance or something like that. When in reality, human society and nature are actually one environment. All right? Different aspects of that, but this is one. All right? It's not really separate. Not in urban settings, not even in the wilderness. It's completely interwoven. All right? So we need to think more along those particular lines, and we also have to realize not only is human society always changing, nature is always changing as well. And both of these things are changing at this time and intermingled. So trying to figure out what to do in the future then becomes that much more complicated. Now, one good example of what I'm trying to talk about here and demonstrate here would be climate change. I'm actually going to say next to nothing about climate change, because we could do a day-long, well, we could do a month-long section just on climate change. You've heard a little bit about it right here. But this just sort of exemplifies how interconnected and interwoven people and nature really are on a global scale. All right. Getting back down to more local examples, I would argue the Lake Michigan shoreline is one that could really benefit from a lot of the principles that I've been talking here today. You've probably heard a lot in the news about high water levels in Lake Michigan. If you're here 10 years ago, you probably heard a lot about low water levels in Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan's very dynamic, goes up and down. Infrastructure is crumbling in Illinois and Indiana, and there's a lot of erosion, or boats are getting in and back and forth. And basically, we don't see a lot of very effective long-term planning with a lot of these particular projects right here. So many of the things where I've talked about today about the integration of people and nature and changing in these trajectories could really fit very well with this particular system. Another one that we are seeing some advances in is the Chicago River. So this is actually Goose Island right here. And then this is a part of the Chicago River over here. This is a project that we have up there where we're installing these floating gardens. All right. At this point, there's not a lot growing on there. It's a little earlier in the year, but later in the year, these are covered with plants, sometimes vegetables, flowers, all that sort of thing. And to see these for the past several years, you would either have to walk along the sidewalk and look down on them, or take a kayak and then come over and visit them. But earlier this year, we've actually installed a floating sidewalk. So now, and it's handicap accessible and everything. So now anybody can go in there and walk along these types of things. And next week, actually, Mayor Lightfoot is going to have a ribbon cutting ceremony for this particular project. So it's getting bigger and bigger all the time. And what it's really doing is it's breaking down this barrier between the Chicago River and the people that live in Chicago. All right? Everybody knows the Chicago River is there, but it was always distant. People didn't really think about it, even if you're going over or walking next to it. And that was the greatest threat to the river, is people not caring about it or drawing that connection with it. Now we're breaking down these barriers so that people can get closer to this and then begin to appreciate that and experience that. And there are other examples of this, such as downtown Chicago with the Riverwalk, which is a similar type of thing, where we're trying to draw these connections. Now, if you were to step back and look at sort of how the Chicago River operates on a fundamental level with the particular processes involved with it, and compare it to other rivers in the world, like this is Kiter Falls in Guyana, where almost nobody lives, there's really no difference between these rivers. It's the context around it. But fundamentally, this river is no different than the Chicago River. The Chicago River flows, yes, through canyons of skyscrapers. This one flows through rainforest over waterfalls in South America. But fundamentally, these ecosystems are the same. Whether you're talking about an urban setting or wilderness setting, they are on different ends of a continuum, if you will, but they're more similar than different. And the same thing goes for people. These are students in Bolivia where I taught a course on aquatic conservation. And once again, people over the planet, once you get down to it, are basically the same as well. And so that's why we like to argue that lessons learned at Wolf Lake or Big Marsh Lake, Calumet, put whatever word you want up there, can help save the planet, because what's happening here is happening globally as well. And this is some of the reasons that we have started this documentary project, Wolf Lake Abides, to sort of address these issues in the modern day in the Anthropocene. And with that, if there's any questions, I would be happy to try to answer them. Sharon.
Yeah, where do you access?
Good to see you. How are you today?
How are you?
I'm good.
Where do you access those floating gardens? I heard about those about 4 years ago at a talk with the city.
Yeah.
But I haven't heard much about how they're progressing either.
Yeah, so it's
That's really interesting.
it's just south of North Avenue.
South.
Behind, there's an REI. The actual access point is at
Oh,
REI
is that
off
REI?
of,
Okay.
I can't remember the name of the road now, but just south of North Avenue. Basically where North Avenue crosses the Chicago River, there's that turning
I thought it was
basin.
somewhere around there, but I've never actually, I think I've seen it in the
Kingsbury,
distance,
maybe?
But
It's a diagonal road.
no.
Is it? Well, it's right.
Kingsbury, right, where the
Kingsbury.
Whole Foods is, and there's
there's-
an art store there.
The pilot project was right behind Whole Foods, and it has now expanded to REI. So right
Okay.
behind REI, so those are the places, right?
Right, and isn't there a plan to make it quite long, this whole?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's expanding all the time, you know.
cool.
What kind of conditions does Wolf Lake have that allow the mud puppy to persist even though it's so sensitive? And what kind of like trends are the populations following?
Right, so 2 questions. You asked about the trends in the population. We don't have a good grasp on that because until a few years ago, nobody really looked at them. So we know in the short term, they seem, I'm gonna say stable, but that's based on limited data. It's interesting. I don't want to talk, we have blood puppy presentations, so you can imagine the whole front. But basically, we've known for a long time that there were mud puppies in Wolf Lake. But they're a very strange creature because they're most active in the middle of winter, not in the summer. And they're salamanders, so they're an amphibian. But nobody sees them in the summer. They go into hiding. And so when most people are out there, you can't see them. But they come out actually under the ice. We start catching them when the water temperatures drop in the fall, and they start disappearing in the spring when water temperatures go back up. And we kind of know what that threshold is now through our research. And so people never really knew they were out there because and they tend to be nocturnal. So these come out at night in January. And so people rarely would see these types of things. The people that would see them were ice fishermen. And so they would catch a lot of these mud puppies. And we have this Save the Mud Puppy campaign. And it's because a lot of people that were fishing would catch these things. They were weird. And they thought that maybe they were a threat to the fish that they were trying to catch and leave them on the ice to kill them. Which is not the case, because they are in no way competing with game fish at all. And so we started this campaign to kind of do that. So we've always kind of known they were there, but it was always accidental until we went out and looked for them, and there were even more than we realized were out there. The way we know that there's a lot of them, well, we release all the ones that we catch, but we put pit tags in them. So the same thing that you put into dogs or cats to trace them, we put those into these mud puppies so that we can see the tags. And we've tagged several hundred unique individuals within, if you know where the flagpole is at Wolf Lake, only within that particular area. We haven't even surveyed the whole lake, so there's a lot of them in there.
How long do they live?
Several years at least. We tagged one and caught it like 4 or 5 years later, actually. So we know they live at least that long. I don't know what the maximum age is, though.
I want to ask if there are other fish species inhabiting Wolf Lake, including lake perch, lake whitefish, burbot, bowfin, what else? And other fish that come from either Lake Michigan or the other couple.
So you're asking about new fish that come from Lake Michigan into Wolf Lake?
Yeah, as well as Lake Calumet and a few other lakes in the Calumet area.
Yes. Somebody want to answer? No, you want to work that, of course. So yes, fish do move back and forth all the time. They do move into the lake. It depends on the particular ones. Burbot, probably not, because they like colder water, deeper water. Lake whitefish would be a bit of a stretch as well. Perch, yes, they can certainly do so. Now, the catch is, the current outlet from Wolf Lake is Indian Creek, and it is partially blocked at times, so that fish may or may not always be able to swim through that blockage. When that blockage was not there, fish could move far more easily. As a matter of fact, what was it, like 10, 20 years ago, it was like elbow to elbow people fishing for salmon along that creek because there were so many salmon swimming from Lake Michigan up into Wolf Lake. And they could in turn go back and forth. And we know that. It may even be possible that mud puppies might be moving back and forth. But because of particular issues that I'm not going to really go into on certain properties, that may or may not be possible right now. So as long as Indian Creek is open. Lake Calumet, yes, they can. Now there are lock and dam structures here and there in the Calumet River, but fish can get moved through those. And I know in the Calumet River, I've seen fish swimming up and down, mostly big fish like rainbow trout and salmon, and so those certainly can move back and forth. And we know that this has been the case since the late 1800s, because someone named Nelson wrote about fish from Lake Michigan swimming into the Calumet River in like a paper in 1876 or something like that. And so much so, and I'll add a few more details here. Calumet region is super flat. Okay, we talk about these ridge swales and dune swales. I mean, a dune is what, this high? I mean, this is like the elevation difference in the region and parts of it. I mean, it's literally that much. When there was a strong wind coming from the north, it would actually pile up Lake Michigan water, and that water would go churning up to the Calumet River. Calumet River typically could be a little muddy. Lake Michigan's a bit clear. You could see this clear water actually moving up the Calumet River, and with that, Lake Michigan fish would swim miles up the Calumet River. When the wind subsided, all that water would then come back out, and then the muddy Calumet water would start flowing back out, and the Calumet River fish would retake those territories, and the Lake Michigan fish would move back out into the lake. And this is the case many, many years ago. That has been severely messed up because of the lock and dam structure, O'Brien lock and dam, and a number of other factors, but it has happened.
Was there a spawning lake sturgeon population years or centuries ago before all this industrialization happened and stuff?
In Wolf Lake or the region or?
Region in places like Indian Creek.
So there are, if you go through and you'll see a lot of mentions that people did say that sturgeon spawned in Wolf Lake and places like that. I don't believe it. It's not sturgeon spawning territory. Sturgeon spawn over cobbles and big rocks, fast flowing water, very clean water. They don't spawn in wetlands. If they were to lay their eggs in wetlands, they would get covered up with silt and be smothered and die. So I do not believe that sturgeon ever spawned in Wolf Lake, Lake Calumet. Maybe they swam far enough, the little cow, grand cow, or something like that, to the moraines where you may have some situations like that. Most of the sturgeon spawning, I think, in the region probably occurred out in Lake Michigan on the Indiana Shoals, which fit this. Now, it's the current from the lake that's creating all the movement of water. So they may have been there, or they may have spawned elsewhere, like St. Joseph River, Kalamazoo River, or places up in Wisconsin and then came down here. Sturgeon numbers in the Chicago region in the late 1800s, early 1900s were massive. There was a huge commercial fishery for it, both in the Calumet and downtown Chicago. They used to catch them like right off of Lincoln Park. There's hot spots for catching lake sturgeon. And for many years they were considered a nuisance. The commercial fishermen would catch them and toss them to the side just to kill them. They might dry them and then would use them as firewood. And it wasn't until later that people realized that there was some type of, that you could eat them and get the oil out of them and all these other types of things, isinglass and some other uses. But they were trash fish for many, many years and considered a nuisance. But because of this long generation time where they take 20, 25 years to reproduce, they were rapidly overfished and have largely disappeared. They're slowly now making a comeback, but it is a very, very slow. So what I think they probably did, I think they did come into Lake Calumet, Wolf Lake, but I think they came into feed. They bought, and then that's about it, and then they went back out into the lake.
And how we combat invasive fish species such as Asian carp, round goby, and others?
Yeah, and nobody has great answers for any of that on how to combat them. The basic strategy right now is to try the best to prevent them from becoming established in the first place, because once invasive species become established, they're very, very difficult to eradicate. So that's sort of the plan, especially with Asian carp right now. and things like that. But for those that are already established in the lake, like Round Goby, it's hard to say. Eradicating them is going to be like next to impossible, probably. That said, and I think John sort of mentioned pros and cons to environmental change. There are pros and cons to invasive species. Round Goby that I had the picture up there is competing with a lot of our smaller fish that live along the bottom, things called darters and gobies like that, and have basically wiped those out in some instances. That's I would put that as a con. As a pro, bass love to eat them. So do lake trout. And in some places, some snakes and things like that. In Lake Erie, there's an endangered species of water snake that 90% of its diet is this invasive round goby. So we have a lot of native fish that are gorging themselves on round gobies and are actually making a comeback because of this particular invasive species. So the invasive species topic is very messy, very complicated, not how you particularly, or how you usually see it portrayed in the media. Like that. And you had a question about what did we do in Wolf Lake so that their mud puppies are there, something, right?
What are the conditions?
What are the conditions? Slag.
Oh,
They
wow.
like the slag?
So yes, you probably picked up that in general in this region, we have a lot of slag. People have been dumping slag all over the place, caused all kinds of problems and that sort of thing. And slag was dumped along the shorelines of Wolf Lake and other types of fill. Mud puppies like to live in very thin crevices. And one of the good places to see this is along the Kankakee River, Hickory Creek, and places like that, where rivers have cut down through the limestone and have eroded the little sections of the limestone, and they like to hide in those cracks. That's kind of native what they like. And in Lake Michigan, they would live on the shoals among the cobbles, which are glacial deposits. They like that sort of stuff. Wetlands are typically not what they really like to do, but by putting all of this slag and boulders and things under there, we have created these little hiding places for them to live all over the places, and that has actually, ironically, benefited this very sensitive species. So in this instance, industry actually helped probably bring back some of these things.
Have you seen them in George Lake, or do you have any sample for them?
I've never really looked for them in George Lake, so I don't know off the top of my head.
In your graphic on the natural ecological succession, you go from Lake Michigan to inland bay, or to bay to inland lake.
Yeah.
What was and of course that was accelerated by the railroads on the north end of Wolf Lake, by Lake Michigan. Do you know, or can you talk a bit about the impact of closing that channel to Lake Michigan, and have you heard much talk about possibly reopening? And what would that do?
Oh, all right, so you're talking about what was known.
Wolf River, yeah. Because it was Wolf Bay. I've seen things with it, Wolf Bay, and of course now it's an inland lake. And it was, my understanding is around World War I is when it was closed off.
Yeah. Did you need this diagram, or you want to? Maybe I should bring up. This is going to take you a minute here to find them.
I think I saw in 1929 topo map that the channel was still there.
Yeah.
1929?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, I'll show you I'm trying to get a.
So was it filled in with leaf growth?
It was filled in a variety of ways. I'm trying to find a map so that everybody knows what we're all talking about. This is taking me a while. Trying to get there. Okay, here's Wolf Lake. So there's a channel up here, and I don't know how well you can see it, but this channel kind of abruptly ends at this point. This used to connect to Lake Michigan, was known as Wolf River. All right, I don't know exactly when it was filled in. I suspect it was probably a gradual process. Maybe, do you know when it was cut off?
I'm thinking around 1920s, but.
All right, maybe. And that I don't really know. And I don't know how much of it was a partial cut off. For example, there's a lot of railroad lines over here, but they probably had a bridge for a while. So you know what I mean. I don't know, but it's closed off now.
It's really close though to the lake.
Yeah, it gets. Yeah, and so what that used to be a more direct connection for fishes and other things to move back and forth in the lake. And we used to see more lake-oriented fish in the lake years and years ago, possibly due to this connection. Although fish can now move through here as well. It's longer, but not hideously long, and back and forth. There has been talk from time to time about reconnecting this, widening this, turning this basically into an estuary, that type of situation. That's, you know, when I had all those future arrows about which direction to go, you have a new opinion, well, I'll put a new arrow on there for that one. I mean, that's just another one of the pressures and opinions about where to go. Can it be done? I mean, you'd have to go through this particular land, does the railroad?
That is a casino.
Casino, yeah.
Well, the casino's on the other end.
Yeah, there's a bunch of regions that it may not be done. I don't know if there's a lot of ecological benefits to necessarily doing that as well. Another thing, I don't have the numbers, but kind of the most polluted part of Wolf Lake is this channel up here, as you can imagine, because they're dumping all the stuff in there. And they have for years, not quite so much anymore. And so when the Army Corps did their restoration projects down here to put the islands in, one of their strategies was to put a bunch of islands here to basically quarantine this section of the lake and then focus on the rest of the lake. That was sort of the reason they did a bunch of work up there. So reconnecting this is going to have to deal with a lot of sediment remediation and all kinds of other issues in that area. Which of course is going to balloon the costs and everything.
Excuse me, have you seen any results of study of the imposition of those new wetlands up there?
I have not, no. I mean, I know the Army Corps is mandated to do 5 years post-work surveys. That's probably out there. I don't know if I saw anything in that to me like was super, super dramatic or beyond expectations. But if you do enough work, those data have to be publicly available because it's a federal agency. So, yeah. You had a question?
Yeah, you said Wolf Lake flows into the Indian Creek Canal. What's the water source that Wolf Lake has and that causes that water flow?
That goes out through there. It's a lot of groundwater. Yeah.
I worked at Lever Brothers for 20 years, and they take water from Lake Michigan, use it in their system, treat it, and put it into Wolf Lake. Yeah.
And that's part of it
They're the
too.
ones that are underway, and before Lever Brothers, I understand there was an amusement park there.
Yeah, it was
And-
part of Yeah, there's.
Lever Brothers was there since 1929.
Yeah, so that's part of the outflow too. There are reports on the hydrology of the lake and the inputs and outputs. They're kind of old, I don't know if they're updated, but they certainly, the regulatory agencies look very closely at how much water is coming in.
Is that groundwater coming?
A lot of it is groundwater, because once again, this is all sand, it's beach. It's sand beach, the water will go through here.
Another
And it's
thing I
flat.
wanted to add about the mud puppies. When we were kids, we'd walk along the shoreline with lights. In midsummer, and you'd see the mud puppies right along.
There you go, yeah.
And in that swamp they filled in between the mills and Hegwish, there were a lot of mud puppies in there.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah.
We picked up different things in the vent. We couldn't grab them because they were so slimy. They just
No, they are. That's a trick. Yeah, the grad students had a steep learning curve trying to figure out how to pick them up to study them.
I was just curious, when you're talking about like that natural progression, like how roughly time-wise, like how long would it, just left alone, would it take Wolf Lake to become? And
Yeah.
what was the next thing? Prairie? I mean, 10,000 years, 1,000 years?
I mean, this,
Yeah.
so for Wolf Lake from here to here, that's 1,000 years.
1,000. Okay.
That was,
Yeah.
well, yeah, it's roughly 1,000 years.
So maybe
we're
we
talking,
roughly-
we are certainly talking long-term here for the entire lake, but bits and pieces of it would be very different. For example, parts of the wetlands could turn to a prairie in a matter of years to decades.
Okay.
Something like that. It's turning to a forest, that's gonna take a lot longer.
Maybe 500 years.
Yeah. So no, this is not something we're not talking months type of.
And one other quick question, I don't know where to find out about that, but you would probably know better than anyone else, as somebody who swims in Lake Michigan a whole lot, like, how clean is it these days? I mean, I always think, oh, it's cleaner than when I was a kid, but I don't know. Could you
Lake
speak-
Michigan?
Yeah.
Wolf Lake? Either? Okay.
No, well, Lake Michigan.
Okay, Lake Michigan?
I've only swam in Wolf Lake once, I think.
So the water quality in Wolf Lake is actually pretty good.
Yeah, I think you said that
It
that
is.
day we were down there.
Yeah, don't dig. Yeah, don't start digging holes in the bottom of it, but the water's pretty, the water's okay. Lake Michigan is pretty, I mean, it's our drinking water.
Right.
And they don't treat it that much, and I'm not knocking on the people treating it, they don't have to treat it that much, because it's pretty clean.
Right.
No, it's in pretty
So
good shape.
for swimming, I mean, it's quite clean. It's not anything that you have to worry about.
So, and I'm gonna give you, no, in general, no, Lake
Yeah.
Michigan should be just
That
fine.
was
But I'm
good.
gonna,
I'm glad. That was my understanding, but like I recently was talking to others, like, oh, I don't swim in there. It's, you know, there's that refinery in Whitey. And I said, yeah, I know. He's
Well,
like,
common
they
sense.
release stuff into the
Yeah.
lake. I'd swim way up north. At first I thought he meant north of Chicago. He meant like Minnesota or something.
Oh, yeah.
You know, wherever.
so I'm gonna give you a couple, well, okay, so a couple of answers. One of those common sense, no, don't swim in the whiting outflows.
Right,
obviously.
of course.
All right, okay, don't do that.
But if you're swimming at North Avenue Beach, that's.
Now, another issue is E. coli and stuff like that. So do pay attention to beach closings in particular bays, and there's a whole program about that. Go online, they monitor all of that sort of stuff very, very closely, and have actually some incredible models modeling a lot of that. And a lot of people are under the perception that those E. coli outbreaks are human. It's like human pollution, and part of it sort of is, but it's also natural, and it has to do with the temperature and turbulence of the sediments underneath, and other various conditions like that can actually cause these outbreaks as well. And if some of these outbreaks sometimes they get even worse, and you can have botulism mixed in there as well, so pay attention to that. But once again, City of Chicago and local municipalities are generally all over that. They're very conservative about that. USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, has developed models that the city uses, and they test on and on and on. So that part, so keep an eye out for those E. coli
Yeah,
outbreaks.
I
in
hear
some of the
sometimes
breaches.
beach closures
Yeah.
because of whatever.
Right,
Yeah.
so you gotta keep an eye on that, don't swim in refinery outflows, and,
Right.
but Lake Michigan itself is pretty clear, and it looks clearer now, of course, than, I mean, did you swim in the lake 50 years ago? 40 years ago? I mean,
Yeah,
I
I
did.
did,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it was a lot murkier,
Right.
okay? That's because of invasive species. So that is the quagga mussels and zebra mussels, an invasive species that came in the same way as the round gobies in the ballast tanks and freighters. Came in, they're only about as big as your thumb, but there's quadrillions of them. I don't know how many are out there. They absolutely cover the bottom of the lake in certain places. They're filter feeders, so they filter out plankton, which is microscopic plants and animals, out of the lake. And there are so many of them, and they've been added since the 1980s, that the lake actually looks clear. So at one time when you dove into Lake Michigan in like the 1980s, you could probably only see around 5-10 feet. Go to that same spot now, you can see 50 to 100.
It does seem clear.
Yeah.
But then it's weird up in Wisconsin, Door County, the beaches there, I've noticed, which I've been swimming in for 50 years or more too, there's like this green glop at the shore. I don't think it extends real far, and I think I've heard that's because of the zebra mussels too, eating so much plankton that more sunlight is coming through the water and making I guess it's algae or.
Yes.
Grow.
So the water used to be.
So that's kind of gross. Now you go in and there's like this pea soup for,
Right.
4 or 5 feet.
So everybody always tries to blame things on invasive species. In some cases, rightly so. In other cases, it's kind of more overreaction. But in that case, it's partially what's happening is that the water used to be so murky that the light couldn't penetrate very far. So there was not much algal growth in Lake Michigan along the bottom. But now that the water's clear, light can get down there, and we get more algae and some other plants, and that's creating some of the goop that you're talking about.
That was my
But that goop has always been there. So depending upon the currents, you could get that regardless of the zebra mussels.
Okay.
But the zebra mussels and quagga mussels are exacerbating that particular situation. I say zebra mussels because that's what everybody's familiar with. Zebra mussels are almost completely eliminated from Lake Michigan. They've been replaced by their close cousins, quagga mussels, which are superior competitors to the zebra mussels. But in Wolf Lake has zebra mussels, and I've yet to see a quagga mussel in Wolf Lake, which is a little strange. Anyway, sorry, yes.
Thank you.
I remember years ago there being fish kills in Chicago on the beaches all the time. Now you don't see those, but I was in Wisconsin and there was a whole beach and the water was full of dead fish.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, and I said it was like a yearly thing that happened.
Usually in the spring, and those are probably mostly alewives. It can happen with other
He
species.
was alewives.
Yeah, it can happen with other species, but it's typically with alewives because they tend to be more sensitive to temperature changes, and so in the spring when the water gets warm,
That's a totally
it gets
natural thing to happen.
sort of. Okay, you're asking a fish biologist for a simple answer to a fish question. Alewives are invasive. They came in through the Willink Canal accidentally, and their numbers completely exploded in the 50s and especially into the 60s. I don't know if people remember that far back. Yeah, this is when bulldozers would have to go up there, bucket loaders, and they would lift them up there.
So is that what I'm remembering on the Chicago beaches? There used to be-
Yeah, probably. Now, and it happened after that, but at a reduced extent. But you can still see a lot of them, and you can still see a lot of them. You're right. Further north, you do tend to see more alewives up there. You don't see it as often now because alewife numbers have drastically plummeted for a couple of reasons. One, salmon were introduced into the lake. The official story for why salmon were introduced into the Great Lakes was to control alewives and get that nuisance species under control. The actual story is various states have been trying to stock salmon into the Great Lakes for about 100 years and failed because there wasn't enough food. So they tried to stock something else, namely smelt, as food, but that didn't take off quite enough for food. And then the alewives came along, and then they're like, oh, finally we can stock salmon in here because there's enough for them to eat. So what we basically have is this invasive species. A popular invasive species was intentionally stocked to eat an unpopular invasive species. Okay. That's a very short version of the story. Now, back end. Alewives eat a variety of different things. The smaller, the smaller eat plankton. All right? These microscopic plants and animals. The same thing zebra and quagga mussels eat. So now, alewives are getting this double whammy. They're being devoured by these salmon from the top, and they're running out of food from down below because of competition from another invasive species. So we have this sort of weird Thunderdome type situation with all these invasive species battling each other. And the alewives lost out, and their numbers started plummeting. And in Lake Huron, they almost completely disappeared, and so did the salmon fishery because there was no longer salmon, or there was no longer food for the salmon to eat. Those early warning signs started to appear in Lake Michigan. Alewife numbers started to plummet. And fishery managers in Lake Michigan began to panic. And what was once this horrible, kind of the poster child for invasive species that we wanted to get rid of, we're now managing alewives to bring their numbers back up so there's more food for salmon to eat. So they're still out there. They're at a lower level. They would actually, ironically, they don't want to come out and say this too much, but they would actually like to see more alewives out there so that there's more food for the salmon to eat because people like to catch the salmon. So their numbers are going up.
Die-off is not a concern that I saw.
No, those numbers are not impacting the population out there at all. No. Yeah.
What's the lamprey number like now?
Lamprey, so to step back, sea lamprey are these sort of eel-like creatures that have a mouth that's a suction cup with teeth in it, and they latch onto the side of a fish and chew a hole in the side of the fish, and they suck out the blood and fluids and stuff like that. Also an invasive species, also came in through the Welland Canal, up through the St. Lawrence and then the Welland Canal, and throughout the Great Lakes, and did a huge amount of harm to a lot of the fisheries, and especially lake trout, because they came in. I can't remember when sea lamprey first entered. It was in the 40s or 50s. It was before a lot of the other things, before the salmon were really there. So the salmon, or the lake trout, really took a hit. A lot of people like to blame sea lamprey for the dramatic declines in lake trout. The reality is we were overfishing the lake trout for decades. Their numbers were going way down. And then the lamprey came in. That was kind of like the last nail in the coffin. Such, though, that lake trout were actually extirpated from Lake Michigan. We had no more native Lake Michigan lake trout. But we did have them in other parts of the Great Lake, and we have since restocked them. They're coming back up. Sea lamprey, they're still out there. Their numbers are moderate, tends to go up and down. But we're paying $17 to $20 million a year to keep those numbers down. And there's growing reaction about those methods, because the way to keep them down is to poison the rivers where they spawn at. And the official story is this poison only affects the lampreys. It doesn't. It affects a lot of other fish in those rivers too, but that's,
Yeah.
and they know that. The other aspect is, another control strategy is to have dams at the mouth of rivers so that they can catch the lamprey at those dams and prevent them from going upstream. Problem now is people love lake sturgeon that we talked about. Lake sturgeon spawn in the same places that lamprey like to do, but cannot get to them because of these dams. So ironically, this invasive species control measure that is trying to control the sea lamprey is also harming the lake sturgeon. And so we're running into some serious conflicts along those lines of Great Lakes.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I had a friend who was, used to laugh and told me that Indiana had declared the Grand Calumet River dead like in 1980. What is the status of the Grand Calumet River? Do you study that? I'm sorry, it's still Calumet region.
Yeah, no, it is. I don't do a lot of stuff in the Grand Cal or a Little Cal. They're doing better. It's slow because of all the sediment contamination. That's the biggest difficulty and cost whenever there are projects associated like that. I would say the numbers are going up. It's slowly recovering, but it's a slow recovery. I would not say it's dead. I would not say it's doing great. But you know, it's getting better. It'd be nice to see it getting better faster, but unless you have a few $1 billion lying around to clean up the sediment, it's kind of hard to figure out what to do. And then restore those wetlands along there. That's really what that needs, is a lot more of those fringing wetlands. That it has some, but it would be great to see, excuse me, a lot more of those. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
One more question.
Sorry.
A while ago, I remember reading an article about some sponges being found at Wolf Lake. Can you elaborate on where they fit in?
Well, I did not know sponges were found there, were they? No, you don't know about that?
Article.
Okay, they could be. Yeah, I'm not debating that. There are actually native sponges in the region. I have seen them in Lake Michigan, so not too far from here. So I know they're out there. They have been found in the Chicago River and other areas like that. They used to be more common in the past, but once again, they are very sensitive to a couple of things. Pollution will do that, but so will sedimentation. So if the water is really silty and covers them up, they will tend to get smothered. So they need the water moving past, because once again, they're filter feeders. So they take the water in through parts of their pores, spit it out another side, and they have to keep doing that. And if there's a lot of fine sediments, that clogs basically their mouth, their intakes, and they kind of get smothered out there. But they were always very sort of low key, at least in recent history. I would say 100 years ago, if you and I were to go out and look for a sponge, we could find one. These days, it's a lot harder, but they are still out there. They are probably more common than people realize because they're very inconspicuous. When people think about sponges, you're probably thinking about what people find in the Mediterranean or off of Florida, where they're like big clumps or maybe this big or something. The ones around here are like crusting. They're like a thin crust over rocks. So they're very subtle and hidden, and you kind of have to know what you're looking for to find them. So yeah, they're out there. They're more common than people realize, but not super.